book, and this talk is based on my work as a family physician, which I did for 20 years. And 7 of those years, I was also medical coordinator of the palliative care unit at Vancouver Hospital, looking after terminally ill people, people dying of cancer, neurological diseases, and so on. And what I found in all those years, learned all those years, what I had not been taught in medical school, is that who gets sick and who doesn't is not accidental. That although we tend to think on cancer and multiple sclerosis, which I mentioned last night, or rheumatoid arthritis, or chronic asthma, psoriasis, eczema, colitis, Crohn's disease, any number of chronic illnesses are somehow random events that unfortunately and mysteriously strike a person. And occasionally we think that we can explain the cause by the lifestyle of the individual, like smoking, of course, and its connection to lung cancer. But other than that, we think that these diseases are either mysterious and unexplainable misfortunes, or they are caused by people's genes. And what I found that quite on the contrary, that who got sick and who didn't wasn't random, and that there were certain identifiable patterns, certain personality traits and ways of behaving that people unwittingly, without knowing it, unintentionally, but they brought the disease on themselves. And that wasn't their fault. They didn't know what they were doing, as you will see. But since we're talking about caregivers, and let me tell you one little fact that, and since the book was published, which is about 10 years ago now, I think, or 9 years ago, there's been so much more evidence tending in the same direction. One bit of evidence about caregivers is that there's a structure at the end of our DNA, our chromosomes. Chromosomes is the strands where our DNA is located in our cells, in the nucleus of our cells. And these strands of chromosomes have at the end a structure called a telomere. A telomere is like the glue at the end of my shoelace to keep the strands from fraying, to keep it together. When we're born, our telomeres are a certain length. And as we get older, gradually, they shorten as we age. And until at the end of our life, they become unraveled, at which point so do we. Now, they looked at but it's a mark of aging, in other words. Now, they looked at the telomeres of mothers looking after chronically ill children. And they found that these women in their 30s and their 40s, their telomeres were 10 years shorter than their chronological age would have predicted. In other words, the chronic stress of caregiving aged them by 10 years.
Which was awesome. And what they did was they sent me their kids and they said, please, Dr. Burke, can you take care of Jimmy? He can't sit still in class. He's fallen out. He's hitting the kid next to him. Please, Dr. Burke, he's got ADHD. Can you put him on some Ritalin? And the funny thing that happened when I did my job, and I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of the kids I saw, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. I was hearing histories of so much trauma. Kids who were witnessing violence in the community. Kids who had brothers and cousins and uncles who were either incarcerated or worse yet, murdered. Kids who were dealing with parents who were suffering from substance dependence or mental illness. And then, in my mind, it was, I could see that there was something that I was missing, but I didn't quite know what it was. And then one day, my colleague, Dr. Whitney Clark, walked into my office and he said, have you seen this? And he was holding in his hand the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And my reaction was probably similar to the reaction of many of you, which was literally, I could feel the clouds part and I could hear the angels singing. Because it just made sense. Everything that I had been seeing, all of my training, everything from medical school to public health school to residency, to the kids that were sitting in front of me day after day after day, it all clicked. And in that moment, it was like You know, as a physician, I will say it was like the discovery that bacteria causes infection, right? You're like, holy moly, this is a game changer. The impact of early adversity and what that does on the health and development of children over the entire life course. It was pretty profound. And so, for the 3 people in the audience who did not raise their hand when I asked them if you knew about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, I'll just briefly go over. This was a study that was done by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and Kaiser Permanente. And what they did was they looked at these 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences, including physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and what they called household dysfunction, parental mental illness, substance dependent, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. And the 2 things that they found that were incredibly striking, number 1, ACEs are super common, right? So 2/3 of their study population had at least one adverse childhood experience, and 12.6% of their population, 1 in 8, had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. Now, this was not Bayview Hunters Point. This was Kaiser San Diego. So remember, we're talking about a population that is 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. And then the second thing that they found that was extremely striking was that there was this dose-response relationship between early adversity and adverse health outcomes. So the higher your ACE score, the more likely that you were to have poor health outcomes like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And when we look at the health outcomes, if you have 4 more ACEs, your risk of diabetes is 160%. If you got pregnant as a teen in their study, your risk of having a miscarriage was 180%. Your overall risk for cancer, 190%. Ischemic heart disease, #1 killer in the United States of America, 220%. Stroke, 240%. Hepatitis, 240%. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, 260%. Depression, 460%. Suicidality, 1,220%. Now, at first we looked at this, right? In fact, Felitti and Anda, the principal investigators of the study, looked at this and they said, okay, now, what's the cause of this link? They thought, okay, you folks who are exposed to early adversity, they're more likely to engage in health-damaging behaviors, and we see this in their risk of disease, right? And it's partly true, but there's more to the story. Now, like I said, it's partly true. If you have 4 more ACEs, it dramatically increases your risk of becoming a smoker as an adult, right? And we see, again, that dose-response relationship. You're much more likely, you're 7.4 times as likely to become an alcoholic as an adult if you have 4 more ACEs as compared to 0 ACEs. And you're more likely to engage in high-risk behavior such as early sexual intercourse. You're 5 times as likely to engage in early intercourse, and you're twice as likely to have teen pregnancy or teen paternity as someone with 0 ACEs. So they were right. If you have, the more ACEs that you have, the more likely that you are to engage in high-risk behavior. And I'm going to put a little asterisk there because there's an important driver behind why, which I'll talk about in a second. But even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, it turns out that you're still at increased risk of all of these poor health outcomes. And in fact, when we looked at the data for lung cancer, for ischemic heart disease, and for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, when you do the logistic regression and you back out all of the health-damaging behavior, that only attenuates about 50% of the risk, right? So there's 2 messages there that are really important. Number 1, if you eliminate the health-damaging behavior, that attenuates 50% of the risk. That's awesome, right? So that's one target right there. But the second piece of it is that, wait a minute, like, What do you mean that if I don't engage in any high-risk behavior, I'm still more likely to drop dead of heart disease or cancer? That hardly seems fair, right? Well, the question is why, and that's why I'm going to talk for a second about the biology of adversity. Now, as many of you who are familiar with this work know, it has to do with the fight or flight response, right? Your hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal Axis. How does it work? You're walking in the forest and you see this guy. Roar! Did I scare you? So what happens? Your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary gland, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland sitting here on top of your kidneys that says release adrenaline, release cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your airways open up, your pupils dilate, you shunt blood to your skeletal muscles, right? Away from your bladder, which is why you pee your pants. And you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. But another thing happens that's really important, right? I'm going to back up. Now, if we look at my friend again, right? He's big, he's got claws, he's got teeth. And if you were to think about it, right, you probably would not take him on. And that is the reason why our body, in this life-saving mechanism, downregulates the functioning of your prefrontal cortex, right? It inhibits your executive functioning and reasoning so that you decide that fighting him is a really good idea. And that's a critical piece of what happens within the fight or flight stress response. The other thing is within the brain stress activation center, the locus ceruleus activates you so that if there's anyone here from Oakland, I apologize, but I will say, picture Raiders fans after a game, right? People are pumped up, right? So this is your within the brain stress activation center. If you're wondering what's doing that, that's the noradrenergic nucleus of the locus ceruleus, and that's the thing that tells your body, I don't know karate, but I do know crazy, right? That's the biological basis for that. And that's awesome if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system goes from being a once in a very long time life-saving activation to being repeated over and over and over and over again. And I want you all to pause for a second and think about some of the kids that you work with. For them, the bear is waiting for them when they get off the bus. Or the bear is waiting for them on the way from home to school. Or the bear is waiting for them when they get home. Right? And this system is activated over and over and over again. And I want to emphasize two things, and this is why I'm so grateful to be able to speak to this audience in particular. Children's brains grow in a way that is experience dependent, and children's brains are uniquely susceptible to the effects of adversity because they are still growing. And so they're making neuronal connections, both, I like to talk about the different types of neuroplasticity. But the thing is, when a child's brain is growing in an environment that is toxic, they have maladaptive brain development. When they're growing in an environment that is healthy, they have healthy and adaptive brain development. And so one of the things that we see is that this repeated stress activation leads to something that we call, the American Academy of Pediatrics has called toxic stress. And I'm going to take a point here because y'all are the preachers. I want to emphasize that toxic stress is not the stressor. Okay, so as you all go out and shout this from the rooftops and talk about it with media and your teams and your groups and whoever that you're talking about, talk about it with parents and your colleagues. I want to make sure that we are all have the accurate information here. The American Academy of Pediatrics has categorized positive stress, which is the stress that I felt 5 minutes ago before I got up on this podium, right? Which is a brief increase in your body's stress activation, a brief increase in that fight or flight response. Then there's tolerable stress, which is a more severe and prolonged activation of your organs and body systems that are responding to stress. And that is buffered, tolerable stress is buffered by the presence of a caregiving system that is able to relieve that stress. Toxic stress is the extreme, chronic, or prolonged activation of the body's physiologic stress response in a way that is harmful to brain architecture and organ system development. So it's literally the physiologic process that is happening. And so that's one of the most important things I want to share with folks